Chapter 7. War. A Good Excuse. War broke out between Iraq and Iran and expanded and grew rapidly. Saddam's invasion was a good excuse for the Ayatollah Khomeini to fulfill his agenda concerning Iraq. We did not know that he would also use the war as an excuse to destroy those who were not in favor of his country's policy. He used the excuse that the country was at war, and any criticism to him would weaken the voice of the true Islam, Shia, and strengthen the voice of the Sunni enemy, Saddam, Israel, and the West. Interestingly, Iranian and Iraqi leaders accused each other of being the Zionist agents in order to justify their invasions and stir their people psychologically against each other until the final goal was obtained, which was the occupation and destruction of Iran for Saddam and the occupation and destruction of Iraq for the Ayatollah Khomeini. The war became a golden opportunity for the mullahs to fight Saddam. It seemed like the prey coming to the hunter. Even when Saddam requested a ceasefire and peace after some months, the Ayatollah Khomeini rejected his request. He said that he could not have peace with the enemy of Islam. Peace with an enemy is like drinking poison, he said. He twisted words in order to avoid peace and show himself as a righteous hero. After 8 years of bloodshed and the death of over 1 million from both Iran and Iraq, the Ayatollah agreed to a peace treaty with Saddam. This time, also, he tried to show himself as a hero again, but in a different way. He likened his peace with Saddam to drinking poison and said that he had no choice but to drink that poison and avoid bloodshed. Some of his followers cried out, praising his humility and harming himself by drinking that so-called poison. They were too blinded to remember his twisted comments when he said at the beginning of the war that he could not drink the poison of a peace treaty with Saddam. We knew that Saddam was a bully. He had once breached Iran's border in the time of the Shah, but the Shah taught him a lesson. This time also, it was he who invaded Iran first, and for this reason, many Iranians, including a great number of those in opposition, believed that Saddam had to be punished. The Iranian armed forces had to fight his army and force them back. However, Khomeini cleverly turned the war into a religious war, the war of righteous ones against infidels. He tried whatever he could and used every form of religious art in order to move people religiously to receive their support for the occupation of Iraq. Many committed Muslims supported his plans and sent their sons, even the younger ones, to war. Almost all of these younger boys lacked army skills. For this reason, many of them died. They were used mainly to show how big the army of Islam was. Before sending them to the war zones, the mullahs asked them to wear head bandanas of martyrdom and declare in street meetings that they were the real followers of Muhammad, ready to fight and die for Islam. During the war, building jihad forced to curtail many activities to support the war effort. The president, Bani Sadr, was in Iran and was the second chief commander in charge of the war after Khomeini, according to the law. I served on the front lines not as a fighter, but in logistics, and avoided death on numerous occasions. My younger brother and my brother-in-law were both injured as fighting soldiers. The war resulted in more than 1 million dead, disabled, and injured Iranians. A candidate for the Islamic Parliament. Since the second year after the revolution, many non-clerical Muslim politicians like me had kept their distance from the vile mullahs and their political party, the Islamic Republican Party. The party was called the Republican Party, but did not have anything to do with the Republic. Its aim was absolute dominance, and we were highly disappointed in its policy. The party's overriding goal was to support the Shiite militias in Lebanon, the Sunni militias in Palestine, and the anti-Semitic Syrian government to conquer Israel. The needs of the public were therefore secondary to the party. We established our own political groups, or independent communities. I had prepared myself and was ready to announce my candidacy for the Islamic Parliament as an independent candidate. The leader of the Islamic Republican Party in our state, Dr. Hassan A. Azodi, was aware of my reputation in the area and therefore urged me to return to the Republican Party and become their candidate for the parliament. But I refused. There was to be a meeting of the Islamic Republican Party delegates in Tehran, and he urged me for the second time to go with him to attend the meeting, hoping that the meeting would change my mind and I would become a supporter of the mullahs. I declined this offer. Dr. Azodi went without me. The meeting ended tragically when a bomb blast killed many attendees, including Dr. Azodi. Eventually, I announced my candidacy as an independent. The public had seen the dirty games of the Islamic Republican Party and were interested in independent candidates. The first Islamic president, Dr. Abu Hassan Bani Sadr, also ran as an independent and won the election with around 80% of the people's vote, a proof that many Iranians were fed up with the mullahs. I was more of a follower of Bani Sadr's political philosophy than of Khomeini's and the mullahs. Dr. Bani Sadr was more liberal in his approach and respected the rights of others. The mullahs' bitter attitudes. My refusal of the Islamic Republican Party's offer resulted in the mullahs' bitter attitudes toward me. When they saw that they had lost their credibility with the people, they sought to retain power through any means possible. Tricks, creating confusion, threats, bullying, and attacks became their daily practices to dominate and stop the opposition. They hired street boys, gangs, ex-aristocrats and their children, and gave them overt money and weapons to create anarchy and serve them with their best. In creating chaos, the mullahs disregarded the rights of the interim government run by Mr. Barzargan and ultimately gained control over all cities. The government was not in their hands officially, but they acquired all army artillery, which gave them the power. Later on, several times they plotted to kill the president, Dr. Bani Sadr. Finally, he, who had won the election with 80% of the people's vote, fled and took refuge in France. The elected president of the people was forced to escape and his government was demolished. Life for the mullahs' opponents became unbearable after the escape of the president. Backed by the Ayatollah Khomeini, the mullahs took control of the government and ordered their followers to openly humiliate and beat us in the streets, the marketplaces, our workplaces, and even in our houses. They invaded homes in the middle of the night and terrorized our families. I was harassed and beaten by their Revolutionary Guards many times in the streets. On one occasion, they gave a rifle to one of my followers, ordering him to kill me. They said if he refused to kill me, they would kill his children and destroy his family. It was the middle of the night when we heard someone knocking at our door. When I opened the door, I saw my friend and co-worker pointing a rifle at me. With astonishment, I asked, "What is the matter? What is this in your hand?" He cried and refused to kill me. He said that his children's lives were in danger if he did not kill me. Though terrified, I told him to shoot me and rescue his children. The sobbing man refused. "I cannot do this," he said. I pulled him inside and we discussed a solution. He decided to go back to his home, get his wife and children, and leave the city immediately. The mullahs were doing this to their opponents in order to compel them to join their party and serve their cause. Parliament election. It was not possible for me to run away despite the threats and persecution. I had already submitted my candidacy for the parliament, and everybody was aware of it. Culturally, it would bring me to a shame if I ran and ignored the trust put in me by my people, especially when I saw that people were behind me despite threats. They were all hoping their votes would change current conditions. They hoped to teach a lesson to the mullahs, that they had no place in their hearts and no choice but to leave power to the people. The mullahs were also hoping that through pressure they would be able to frighten people and force them to give up supporting us. The aristocrats of the area advised the leader of the Islamic Republican Party to nominate a cleric for the parliament who had been in their service for years before the revolution. The Islamic Republican Party was searching for support from every faction and therefore accepted their advice and nominated a mullah who wanted to get rid of me at any cost. I received a threat from his followers that if I went out of my house on the day of election, they would shoot me. They already had marked those who were my supporters and attacked them in the voting areas. The mullah's philosophy was that they were the only ordained people of Allah, Hezbollah in Arabic, and they had to overcome opposition at any cost. They therefore were striving to eradicate all of us. They used whatever it took to paralyze our organizations. They even used these tactics on their own family members who supported other parties or independent candidates. The mullahs did what it took to control the election and prevent other candidates from entering parliament. The guards and the mullahs' representatives threw many boxes containing votes into a river in my hometown, keeping only those boxes that held the majority of votes for them. Eventually, they got their own candidate into the parliament. Visiting Khomeini. My followers and I decided to visit the Ayatollah Khomeini to communicate to him the injustices done to us by the mullahs and to plead with him for counsel and help. We collected documents, proofs of the fraudulent election, and headed for Tehran. We were hoping that the Ayatollah Khomeini would listen to us and act justly, but we were denied a meeting with him and told he was not well. We were referred to the Ayatollah Imani Jamareini, who was housing the Ayatollah Khomeini, and assured that Jamareini would take our message to Khomeini. We showed Jamarini the documents and explained the injustices of the mullah in our city. Jamarini was aware of the crimes and angry with the top Republican Party mullahs. He said that they treated the Ayatollah Khomeini like a remote control to get whatever they wanted. They passed their messages and plans to people through the mouth of the Ayatollah Khomeini, using or abusing his supreme position in order to make their words and plans receivable by people. He said that Khomeini had no choice but to convey their commands. Behind the curtain, they were the leaders, not Khomeini. They worked through Khomeini because he was still the leader in the people's mind, and it wasn't time for the surrounding mullahs to get rid of him yet. He told us quietly and with clear words, "You have a hard and dangerous task ahead. Unfortunately, without their confirmation, Khomeini cannot listen to you." Some members of our convoy became terrified when they discovered the mullahs had nailed down their dictatorship and there was no hope for anyone to stand up for their rights unless they were pro-mullahs. Back home, many of these friends reduced their relationship with me and eventually lived as strangers to me in order to survive. Shortly after the entry of my parliamentarian competitor, the Ayatollah Yunus Erfani, 3 of his clergy friends were appointed as judges in the Revolutionary Supreme Court, ruling over many cities. The judge of our city's Revolutionary Court and the Supreme Religious Authority, who represented the Ayatollah Khomeini and led the Friday prayers over our city. One of his young, ruthless guards also was appointed as the revolutionary mayor over the city. These 4 people made life hell for me, depriving me of the right to work or gain money for my family. I could either continue as their opposition and endure a painful life, or bow down and make myself their slave. I made my decision, knowing it could mean death. I would not succumb to their threats. The hardship I faced at the hands of these Muslim brothers gradually exposed the true values of Islamic political philosophy to me and many others. People were shocked at how badly oppositions and political prisoners were treated. Still, some of us did not want to lose hope of freedom since it was still the early years of the Islamic-style government. We were ready to pay the cost of freedom by exposing the deceits of the ruling mullahs. The mullahs were also trying to establish their absolute authoritarian leadership at any cost, using references from the Quran and Muhammad's sayings to persuade people that Islam could not be established without force. Allah has ordained Muslims to be harsh. Khomeini's silence. The Ayatollah Khomeini kept silent about the injustices of the Republican Party mullahs. We, the Democratic Front, still hope to win over the country and rule by our own type of Islamic justice. In our minds, we falsely held on to the idea that the Ayatollah Khomeini would stand for the democratic leadership of Dr. Bani Sadr and would not praise the mullahs who thirst for dictatorship. We thought that his silence did not mean agreement with the mullahs, but that he was acting as our patient father who would soon stop their destruction. Our view was strengthened when Khomeini's own son, a cleric living with him, expressed support for Dr. Bani Sadr's leadership by speaking against the Republican Party mullahs. There were also other renowned and influential clerics who were Khomeini supporters and longtime friends who spoke against these mullahs. We had hoped that he would one day break his silence in favor of us. Though Khomeini's silence was strange and unbearable, we had no choice but to wait. We took it as a gesture of Iranian paternalistic culture that encourages children to wait and parents to stand up, break the silence, and say to his rebellious children, "Enough is enough, stop it." Though we were impatient for the arrival of such a moment, we never thought that our cries and criticisms would be ignored. We believed he would eventually break his so-called fatherly silence, and he would stand up for us against the abusive mullahs. If that happened, he would have received much appreciation and praise for helping the well-being of his country. Alas, his silence became an omen of death to us and all those in opposition, and a sign of destruction for the whole country. His silence resulted in humiliation, imprisonment, and the death sentence for many of us, including his own son and grandson. His silence was part of a plot that only became clear when it was too late for us to fight our false father. We never suspected that he and his surrounding mullahs would sanction the death of even their own children for the convenience of Islamic authoritarian politics. The Ayatollah Khomeini's deceptive silence sprang from the Islamic doctrine of taqiyya, legitimate deceiving, nurtured under the wings of an evil spirit which was waiting for the right moment to transform Iran into a Sharia-compliant Islamist state. This Sharia transformation would destroy the social and political promises of the revolution and turn it into a bastion of Islamic terrorism against Iranians, Israel, the West, and all infidels. Khomeini was waiting for the right moment to reveal his radical Islamic totalitarianism to aid in the destruction of all groups who hope for freedom. In those moments of silence, Khomeini's surrounding mullahs knew that he was waiting for them to subtly create more division among the democratic voices. They worked to disable the democratic groups in every possible way to make it easier to establish their own united front. They succeeded because no opposition group was able to unite with other opposition groups. The mullahs saw the ground was ready for a takeover and immediately rushed from the shadows of manipulation into the corridors of full power. They captured everything and then marched openly to extinguish the democratic voices. First, they aimed at President Bani Sadr's position in life. As a result, Bani Sadr had no choice but to flee the country. After this, one by one, those in opposition were targeted by the power-seeking mullahs. Some of those in opposition were able to leave the country, but many were unable to escape. They were killed or given life imprisonment or were forced to compromise. The Establishment of Shari'a. The mullahs used stealth and intrigue to seize complete power in various government offices. This also gained them many followers. Then they steered their people to raise their voice in favor of Sharia's establishment in every place, so everything could be ruled according to the Islamic principles. To turn around the country's culture and make it theocratic, the mullahs elevated religious leadership above everything else, so nobody had the right to speak out against their words and decisions. Eventually, they established Sharia and began to terrify people with implementing slashing and death sentences in streets and squares. People were gripped with fear. Even leftists, who did not believe in any religion, started to bow down to the mullahs and act religious because of the unbearable persecutions. One of my old friends who held a high position in a significant government office told me that one day that he saw Mr. Hassan Tabari, a renowned Iranian communist leader, praying the Islamic daily prayer in a famous prison in Tehran. When the bubble of Islamic holy deception or taqiyya burst, many of our fellow citizens discovered that it was too late to fight the mullahs or stay away from them. People suddenly discovered that the path of vicious radicalism was set wider than any other way. They had to decide whether to side with the mullahs and live, or stay away and be deprived of everything or die. The fear of destruction overshadowed everyone. Not many dared to take a look at their situation and ask themselves how and in what way their decisions would shape their and their country's future life. They were not able to think strategically, but rather took refuge under the unethical wings of the mullahs and made the destruction of Iran their daily agenda. Many pro-democratic Iranians broke down morally and gave up courage because of the mullahs' ferocious use of terror. Some were gradually absorbed into the regime to avoid social and political deprivations. Furthermore, they started to say that they were wrong about the mullahs and had now found truth. Instead, they were working with them to uproot the remnants of Western culture in Iran. They themselves started to preach what they had once called a foolish doctrine, blaming supporters of democracy with words like Zionist, Western agent, etc., torturing us emotionally. Things changed shockingly for the worse. Even many of my friends who were once victims of dictatorship and loyal advocates of freedom joined the mullahs and functioned as the hands and legs of Islamic dictatorship, shooting their zeal for freedom in the foot. Some of these so-called champions of freedom undertook the role of spying for the mullahs, and others became persecutors of freedom fighters in prison. One of my humble followers was appointed as the head of the prison, viciously persecuting and torturing opponents. Many others also were enthralled by superstitious Islamic commands, which encouraged them to follow the mullahs blindly as Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, had commanded. Striving in the path of Allah is incumbent on you, along with every ruler, whether he is pious or impious. Since the Ayatollah Khomeini was related to Muhammad genealogically, nobody could say or even imagine that he had an impiety in his life. The only choice was to follow him blindly. So the quality of leadership was not an issue for many people anymore, but what Islam said and conditions dictated. Many of our young people who were once shouting for democracy in the streets of Iran and were ready to give their lives for it were now employed to impose the mullahs' authoritarianism over their nation at every level of life. Some were also encouraged to join Muslim militias in Lebanon and Palestine to fight against Israel. The ground was progressively prepared, so everybody felt obligated forcefully to fight the mullahs' opponents or otherwise face persecution. After the mullahs seized power, they also seized all pro-monarchists and Western businesses and forced the expatriates out. The country became disconnected from the outside world, although it was still dependent upon foreign products on many levels. It fell into a great economic recession. The economic depression also made many people needy and more vulnerable to the mullahs' influence. The mullahs started to blame the West, Israel, and the Democratic Front for the country's shortages. Nearly every day in the cities, the mullahs gathered their chanting followers in the streets to blame America and Israel for the problems of the country and show the opposition that they had the people's support. People in government offices, schools, and universities who received salaries from the government were forced to join the street propaganda meetings. The mullahs turned schools, universities, hospitals, and all public places into religious political centers. They Islamized every aspect of life. Their morality was low wherever they stepped foot because the words of the Quran says that the righteous followers of Allah had to act harshly. Fear shadowed the public. Close relatives and friends whispered in each other's ears, Devar mush darad, mush gush darad, which means the wall has a mouse, the mouse has ears. In other words, watch your tongue. Don't even trust your family members, since subtle deceptions are hard to distinguish. We therefore were no longer able to speak about our rights to anyone except to whisper in the ears of those few friends who still had secret courage and desired the rule of the mullahs to fade away. On the cultural front, life went downhill and thousands of younger people left their heritage and were absorbed into the Revolutionary Guard, Sepa, and to the correcting religious guard, Basijis. These were established to Islamize the country and make sure that everybody lived according to Islamic principles. What was envisioned before the revolution as prosperity and creativity now became a lifestyle for many to persecute fellow citizens. These younger religious guards were led by the mullahs to torture and kill people in public places. They wanted to terrify people and extinguish any desire for opposition, thus gaining more power. The mullahs used economic downturn, unemployment, and poverty as a means to gain power and rule endlessly. Under the garment of morality, they did whatever they could in order to justify their violence in the name of Islamic rule and establish their despotism. People who cared for their culture and country started to think that their best days were left in the past, the kingdom of the Shah, but it was too late. The mullahs also used the widespread and traditional choice slogans of anti-Semitism as a strong weapon for misleading the masses. They wanted to establish themselves as the legitimate Islamic rulers who have authority from Allah to destroy Israel. Any opposition was marked with the demonized words of Jew or American and eventually crushed. The mullahs hated a Western-style freedom and patiently waited with their tyrannical principles for years until they could enslave us. Because of fear, people had to be ready to sing the song of Down with America and Israel any time the mullahs wanted protests in the streets. If a business did not close for protest, then the owner could be blamed with the words Zionist or Western spy. The mullahs created an atmosphere where everybody was pro-mullah, anti-America, and anti-Israel. The mullahs left us only two options: to rescue ourselves from their humiliations, discrimination, and attacks, or to surrender ourselves to their tyrannical leadership and join others in torturing opponents and our nation. A few opponents who struggled to stomach such an allegiance chose to be humiliated rather than humiliating others, but many joined the mullahs. It was a painful experience for me to see to what extent the courage of my democratically minded fellow citizens failed them and fell short of preserving their nation's rights and prestige. Worse yet, they who once showed intelligence and cried for freedom now chose to cast their votes for an oppressive regime and surrendered their birthright of freedom for their children and grandchildren in exchange for the mullah's favor. One of my followers was one of my persecutors when I was later taken to prison. Many others, like him, saw the mullah's bloodiest commands as legitimate and called their actions righteousness. Because of fear, people started to stay away from opponents of the regime. They did not want to risk their families. Under the authoritarian and self-centered Islamic government, our society's moral character diminished, and some got paid for persecuting others, causing people to forget that they needed to uphold and take care of each other. Because of this, our beautiful country fell into the hands of a power-thirsty sect which saw every other thing as secondary, including national coherence. The mullahs were living their best days. These religious tyrants followed the humiliating philosophy of Islam and made savvy use of proxy gangsters, criminals, and terrorists to handcuff people and push them further and further behind, truly impacting the country negatively for generations to come. The media also fell into the hands of the mullahs. They stopped reporting anything irrelevant to the mullahs and censored every idea that was contrary to their way of thinking. They were used as the most influential channels for authorizing Sharia to dominate every area of life, allowing things which were once a disdain to Iranian culture. They loudly and proudly announced the bloodthirsty culture of Muhammad superior over Iranian culture. They wanted to eradicate national identity and dress with hostile Meccan culture. Sometimes they spoke in favor of Iranian identity, but such statements were only for public consumption. Blind obedience became the channel for the Ayatollah Khomeini to claim to be ruling in Muhammad's place. People believed him and forgot the pride of our nation that sheltered tolerance and protected the rights of everybody, no matter what race, religion, or color. They sadly poured their Persian identity under the feet of the Ayatollah and the mullahs, and offered up our beautiful country as a nest to terrorism. Now we hear and read that thousands of the children of those blinded fellows in Iran are protesting for freedom in the streets, and many get slaughtered by tyrannical mullahs every year. They bullied, humiliated, and destroyed our lives without thinking that the dictator mullahs would also destroy their own children in the future. I was often bullied and mocked by younger religious guards in the streets. I witnessed and experienced how these younger followers of the mullahs shouted catcalls and curses in the streets after humiliating us and fell over one another to cheer their victory. The most humiliating part was that some of these younger fellows were my own relatives. It is so sad to see that the children of the revolutionaries are suffering now from a regime to which their parents dedicated their lives. Before the revolution, we could not imagine that the day would come to our country when we would be humiliated by those who were claiming to be pro-democracy. The mullahs fought with us, claiming they wanted to end authoritarianism in Iran forever. However, their own regime became more despotic and unethical than the Shah's and any other regime since the dominance of Islam in Iran. We were shocked, confused, and frustrated. We felt crushed under the mullahs' subtle deceptions or Islamic taqiyya. Once we had strived for the Iranian dream, but then surrendered to despair and destruction. The pressures people faced were so great, and they stopped listening to our cries. The hostility of the mullahs towards Western investors led the country into economic crisis, slowing down manufacturing activity, causing job losses, escalating gas prices, and causing food shortages. People struggled just to live and had nothing left in them to care about the mullahs' destructive plans. The mullahs took over big businesses and made them governmental. They did not listen to experts, but appointed people at the top of the organization who did not have any organizational skills. Experts who did not agree with them were sacked and forced to leave the country. Blind obedience and allegiance surpassed the quality of work and life. As a result, the economy failed and the distribution of everything became subject to coupons. People had to wait hours and days in lines in order to get rice, eggs, and their other daily needs. The mullahs said that they would rather die in hunger than have a relationship with the West. They wished to seize the wealth of the West rather than growing wealth through a friendly relationship with them. Unemployment increased. The nation lost its purchasing power and started to suffer through all aspects of life. Poverty and struggle to find food changed people's attitudes. Corruption started to soar and overshadow almost every citizen. Almost everyone became active in taking Iran to new depths of moral collapse. None of these moral failures mattered to the mullahs. Instead, they defended their actions with the relevant Quranic and Islamic references, calling the rule social justice and compassion, and labeling others as Israeli or American agents. Under repression and fear, many of our relatives were unconsciously turned into spies for the mullahs. Since the problems of a person in Islam are also counted the problems of his family or community, every family or community was compelled to watch the behaviors of others in order to avoid problems as much as they could. If your parents or community leaders doubted your behavior, they would immediately warn you or call a religious guard if you ignored their warnings and continued your opposition. Because of fear, friends betrayed friends, handing them over to the mullah's persecuting guards. Many were imprisoned, tortured, given lifetime imprisonment, and slaughtered. Others were forced into drug addiction to destroy their zeal for freedom and discourage other youth from supporting opposition. It had only seemed like yesterday that our dictator king was replaced by a peace-loving mullah, the Ayatollah Khomeini, with a promise of freedom and prosperity. Our backbones were broken, as Iranians say, and we were left paralyzed in every aspect. We were angry at ourselves for our ignorance and our failure at having a sound vision for the future of our country. The mullah's very clever deception impaired our vision and plans and made us unable to anticipate our future with them. The mullahs were a minority before the revolution. We were not aware that they had no option but to wait with patience and guile. They knew that Islamic dominance would not take place with sincerity and openness. They even endured the relatively secularist approach of the interim government in the first year after the revolution, as secularism is contrary to Islam's harsh political philosophy, and waited for the right time to act. They sought for the right moment when hunting their prey. They waited and eventually succeeded. They did not lose their temper even when Dr. Bani Sadr, known as pro-Western by the mullahs, won the presidential election with 80% of the people's vote a year after the revolution. They knew that this was a great victory for pro-democratic Iranians. They knew that they needed time to confuse people and bring their very subtle and tactical maneuver into work in order to confuse people and redirect the revolution from its main purpose. They did so by chasing three crucial tactics patiently. First, they challenged people and said that if they were true Muslims, they needed to follow in the footsteps of Muhammad and his so-called rightly guided successors in order to gain the favor of Allah. Leadership in Islam has an incredible appeal with Muslims who are greatly dependent on Islam and desire to trust their so-called holy leaders in order to reserve a righteous life that secures them from the punishment of Allah in the afterlife. For this, Muslims need to believe in the sovereign rights of those who rule in Muhammad's place. Muhammad and his successors had sovereign rights over people and everything. The Ayatollah Khomeini also needed to establish such a right if Iranian Muslims wanted to live with Islam and for Allah. People called themselves Muslims, but until then, they had never been publicly challenged by a leader that they were not living an Islamic life, since they were not following and imitating a religious leader. They were told it was time for them to take their faith in Islam seriously. With this challenge, the mullahs brainwashed us first and then took the idea to the parliament as a bill, passed it as law, and therefore established a sovereign right for the Ayatollah Khomeini legally as the supreme leader. This crafty approach worked among our fellow Muslims and chained us to the absolute dictatorship of Khomeini and his successors to the end. Now, nobody had any right to challenge his decisions, and nothing could be legitimate without his approval. Once I said in a public talk, Iran will not have freedom if we do not support good ideas and creativity but criticize static ideas. We need to be able to criticize everything and everybody, even our leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, because everybody can be wrong or make a mistake. This was used as a reason for my death sentence, since mullahs believed that the Ayatollah Khomeini could never be wrong. The president, Bani Sadr, had met with some of the mullahs and expressed his concern that the absolute right of a leader is the complete loss of freedom. He, however, was not able to fight against the very identity of Islam in the presence of a majority of Muslims, as this would have cost him his life and position. The bill was finally passed and yoked all Iranians to the power of the Ayatollah Khomeini. The mullah's second approach was to denigrate the plans of the democratic groups and characterize them as non-Islamic agents of the West, since they were using the word democracy, which was a construct of the West. They succeeded in this also, since the general mindset was already prepared against the West by the revolutionaries. The mullahs said that Iran did not need a Western-style democracy, but an Islamic-style democracy, in which people are only free to do what Islam commands. Freedom is for following Muhammad, but not for rejecting him. Their third approach was to put the sovereign right of the Ayatollah Khomeini into practice and deal with opposition according to the Shari'a, the law of Islam. It was after this that any opposition to the mullahs turned into an uphill battle and failure. It was at this point that President Bani Sadr was attacked by rockets. His presidency collapsed, and he had to run for his life. Of course, a fourth component was needed for the mullahs to protect them nationally and fulfill their mission internationally. The two branches of the Iranian version of Hezbollah, Sepah and Basijis, were created so that these armies could rescue them from any possible coup, similar to what happened in 1953 AD to the revolutionary Prime Minister of Iran, Dr. Mossadegh, and the coup that returned the Shah to power again. Because of this, the mullahs closely watched the officers of the General Army who were trained by the Shah and promoted only those officers who showed loyalty to the mullahs. The mullahs' second goal in establishing Hezbollah was to invade countries around Iran, destroying the rights of Western secularism and preparing Muslim nations to capture Israel. They wanted a Middle East without Israel and Western influence. In the meantime, the mullahs started to invest huge amounts of the country's wealth in Lebanon and Syria. They wanted to strengthen the Hezbollah to gain power in Lebanon and establish Iran as the number one enemy to Israel in the region. They began to employ everybody who came to them, especially younger people, to establish a stronger Hezbollah, or the Army of Allah, in Lebanon. All these elements show that the mullahs were the best organized group who had a plan to dominate Iran rapidly, even though they were in the minority. We were all shocked at how these minority mullahs captured the country in a short time after the revolution and were able to silence the majority. A 1,400-year-old problem. We were cleverly deceived so that we could foolishly and blindly surrender ourselves to the mullahs in Iran. In the years before the revolution, they seemed open-minded, so we shared our feelings with them. They were great listeners then, but after the revolution, the same mullahs terrified us and our families. The moral sickness they displayed choked our hearts with fear. They started with terrorizing individuals. Then they massacred communities who favored local leaders. They slaughtered thousands of our contemporary innocent Kurds, something Iran experienced when Arabs invaded Iran in 7th century A.D., or when Genghis Khan swept over Iran in 13th century A.D. People like me who have survived death in the Middle East and taken shelter in the West cry out to Western communities to be aware of the radical Muslims' ambitions. However, many offer excuses to avoid the issue. Some say that Western people have established freedom strongly, so Islamists will not be able to take over. But they say this at a time when Islamists have already strengthened their roots, penetrated many political arenas, established Shari'a in some areas, and are posing a great threat to life in the West. Our own personal testimonies and experiences that speak volumes about Islamists are ignored or discounted. Why should we not be at least a little worried that Islamists in the West may follow the footsteps of their peers who shed the blood of millions in Islamic countries? Sadly, many who are deceived by Islamists do not want to face the truth, but unwisely take the easy option of assuming that Islam will be different in the West. They choose to ignore the words and deeds of Islamists in the West, which point to the fact that Islam cannot be compatible with any democratic values, and Islamists will not be able to tolerate democracy after they gain power. Minority Islamists in Iran approached us in a similar way they're approaching people in the non-Islamic societies. None of us who were fighting for freedom could have imagined that our unity with the mullahs would pave the way for their tyrannical rule that rejects justice. That's why we are crying loudly and pleading that people should not trust Islamists or anyone else who says that Islam is a religion of peace. In Iran, we were unable to discover that the fundamental problem was not the committed followers of Islam, but Islam itself. It is Islam that leads mullahs to establish a Bedouin-style rule in Iran. It was Islam that guided the heavy hands of Islamic governments to prevent Iranians from relying on the great values of their culture, which cherished individual rights, and pushed back Islam's inhumane values. Cyrus, the great king, left a great legacy for us to resist fascism. This legacy has never been so raised up in the history of Iran since the invasion of Islamists as it was in the time of the Shah. We were proud of our culture and did not believe that Islamists could take over in the face of what we had inherited from the great King Cyrus. I, Cyrus, announce that I will respect the traditions, customs, and religions of the nations of my empire, and never let any of my governors and subordinates look down on or insult them while I am alive. From now on, I will impose my monarchy on no nation. Each is free to accept it, and if any one of them rejects it, I never resolve on war to reign. While I am king of Iran, Babylon, and the nations of 4 directions, I never let anyone oppress any other, and if it occurs, I will take his or her right back and penalize the oppressor. And while I am monarch, I will never let anyone take possession of movable and landed property of others by force or without compensation. While I am alive, I prevent unpaid forced labor. Today, I announce that everyone is free to choose a religion. People are free to live in all regions and take up a job provided that they never violate others' rights. No one should be penalized for his or her relative's faults. I prevent slavery, and my governors and subordinates are obliged to prohibit exchanging men and women as slaves within their own ruling domains. Under the creed of Cyrus, a government cannot restrict the rights of people and dominate their rights, beliefs, emotions, and everything else. He's saying that as the King of Kings, he is ready to limit his rights for the freedom of people. He left a legacy which encouraged us to stay out of others' lives and let fellow citizens, no matter what their rank, race, or religion, put their ideas into practice and exercise their creativity for the good of their country and communities. As a successful king, Cyrus knew that no community could survive without individual autonomy and achievement. He decided to stand for individuals' freedom. We never thought that Islamists would be able to rise to power in the face of our Iranian culture and in the face of the 20th century civilization. How could the democratic and participative values of this great king, which so shaped our culture, give way to the authoritarian and repressive principles of mullahs permitting Islam to take over our lives? Islam is the number one religion for promoting deception. The Quran says that Allah is the best of deceivers. What can be expected from Allah's committed followers if their spiritual leader is known as the best of deceivers? This is what the non-Islamic societies in the world need to know about Iran. They need to understand what Islam does to the citizens of a country if they ignore the internal components of Islamic teachings. We were deceived very subtly. No matter how long Islamists live with people and no matter how many times people discover their deceptions, they are still clever in hypnotizing people and deceiving them continually. They seek out new methods of deception in order to yoke people. Iran has been the battleground between Persian and Arabian cultures from the first day of the Islamists' invasion. Iranians continued to remember Cyrus and Darius, the great kings, but mullahs schemed to redirect and control their minds. Throughout the Islamic history of Iran, Islamists knew that they could not separate Iranians from their past. Before the revolution, if a person spoke against the kings Cyrus and Darius, he would lose his place in the community. Aware of this nationalistic solidarity, the Islamists had planned a new way to destroy the patriotic behavior of Iranians after the revolution. They strove to falsely identify themselves with people in order to establish themselves strongly among the people and then destroy them from the inside out. Since the rise of Islam to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Islamist mullahs had never mixed intimately with Iranian culture. Everybody in Iran knew that they were the representatives of Arabian culture and practice and opposed those who cherished our Persian culture. We were Muslims in the context of our Persian identity. As practicing Muslims, we were sometimes under the impact of mullahs but felt guilty spiritually for holding our culture above Arabia's culture in the time of the Shah, fearing that Allah would punish us. However, the common love for the country was strong and was justified in one way or the other. Mullahs in Iran were dealing with such people. They always wished Iranians to be like Egyptians, Iraqis, Syrians, Lebanese, and others who had lost their national identities and called themselves Arabs because of their trust in Islamists and because of their loose attachment to their cultures and languages. But Iranians were different. They had frustrated the Iranian mullahs for centuries with their strong patriotism. At the beginning of 16th century A.D., Sheikh Safi al-Din Ardabili, a radical mullah from northern Iran, established himself with a strong army, captured the whole of Iran, and made Islam the formal religion of Iran, opening the door for Arabian culture. Yet even with his great army, he was unable to extinguish the culture of monarchy in Iran, and his descendants had no choice but to establish themselves as kings in order to win the favor of Iranians. As a result, Arabian culture lost another opportunity. Our contemporary mullahs had to use all their skills of manipulation to destroy the great legacy Iranians inherited from Cyrus and Darius so they could establish themselves and forever prevent Iranians from challenging them. That was what we experienced from the days after the revolution. With the help of some leftists, mullahs called the kingdom unfashionable. They established the Hezbollah in Iran, a strong military power which aimed to destroy our culture and free values. After this, they attempted to export terrorism through Hezbollah and kill even fugitive pro-monarchist and democratic Iranians abroad. Over the past 30 years, they have killed or disabled many Iranians in other countries, especially in the West. The Ayatollah Khomeini said to Iranians before the revolution that it would be all right with him if Iranians wanted the monarchy again after the collapse of the Shah. He knew that Iranians wouldn't want to separate themselves from the kingdom system and from Iran's founding kings. Before the revolution, he was afraid to fight the kingdom culture of Iran directly. We never asked if he was genuine in his words or why he had never spoken about a possible successor for the Shah. This was the usual case in Iran's kingdom history. Our passive thoughtlessness meant we did not question his focus on overthrowing the Shah and left future plans for the future. Another reason for Iranians to lose to the mullahs was that the West, especially America under the presidency of Jimmy Carter, withdrew from supporting the Shah and believed in Khomeini's lies when he said he would establish a democratic country. The third reason for us to lose to the mullahs was they were better organized than other groups in the country for a complete takeover. We were just a bunch of people, mostly young, who loved democracy without knowing or planning a path to democracy. The fourth reason for the mullahs' success was their commitment to kill or be killed for the restoration of Shari'a and the Islamic imperialism of the caliphate. For them, the end justifies the means. They got their way through deception, intimidating, and eventually murdering reformers. They even killed some mullahs who were of the same rank and in competition with them. Before the revolution, they joined with the students who fought for democracy. This was a new, deceitful tactic that has never been used by Islamicists since the rise of Islam. They knew that Islam rejected democracy, but this time they were deceitfully humble, tolerant, and flexible with convincing attitudes. They amazed us, and we entrusted the leadership of the revolution to them. In reality, they were the more ideological and disciplined revolutionaries whose ambition was to mask their aims. They showed patience, pretending to be modest in order to gain momentum. Their long-term goal was held secret until they attained power and revealed their ferocious attitudes to us when we were no longer able to compete with their cruelties. Many kept silent, many died, and many others fled the country as a result. The fifth reason for the mullahs' easy takeover was their zeal for war. They were masters in creating tensions and making wars. For Islamists, war is always a good tool for restricting the freedom of nationals. They create enemies and start wars. Time after time, the Ayatollah Khomeini announced that the country was at war with Iraq, war with Israel, war with the West, and war with the national enemies. In a state of war, nobody has the right to criticize his government and thereby create a pretext for the nation's enemies. The mullahs' goal in all of this was to demonize Western democracy and modernity and make their authoritarian caliphate a role model for the future of Iran. They subtly gained the support of some Western leaders in the name of democracy, redirected the revolution, and demolished the kingdom of the Shah because they feared that the Shah would open his country to Western democracy more and more while taking people further from Islam. War was a good option for the mullahs to stop the spread of Western democracy. A sixth reason for the mullahs' success to overcome us was their ruthless approach to people. No coherent logic works for them. Their logic is belligerent assertion. If you use reason against them, your fingertips and head must be chopped off. Life, laws, and relationships are all disregarded in the name of Allah. They were free to break laws for the sake of Allah and invade people's personal lives. They never believed that laws could apply to them. They attained power at the cost of people's freedoms and rights. After the revolution, I experienced time and again their use of threats to extort money from people, mainly the wealthy, in order to finance their terroristic plans. They were charging families for every bullet used in killing someone from that family who stood in their way. The mullahs kept all these plans secret and showed themselves to us as moderates before the revolution. We did not understand the implications of their words and were unable to see beneath the surface of their doctrine, which gave them rights to deceive even their own children if the conditions necessitated. Their artificial kindness controlled our minds so that we were not able to maintain a balanced relationship with them. Their subtle presentations induced us to follow them and pay any price to oust the Shah. We were unable to think about what would happen if they changed their minds in the future and wanted to get involved in politics. These mullahs were well prepared and were able to play us. They used words such as freedom and prosperity to make us believe that what they intended was not any different from what we intended. Before the revolution, they never spoke about the Islamization of Iran, only about the liberation of Iran from dictatorship. Their words and attitudes were so different after taking power. Their real agenda was that they wanted to release Iran from the influence of Western democracy and freedom and rule over it by the principles of Islam. They hated the slightest innovation that reflected the West. For this reason, they aspired to kill all those who wanted democracy. They did everything to yoke the country under the rule of Islam and advance their ideology. They spread their radical narrative into every school, university, organization, and into mainstream journalism. For the cause of Islam, they sacrificed every scholarly standard that would give knowledge of freedom and prosperity to people. They imparted indoctrination on ancient Arabian nomadic culture. They indoctrinated the university students and ensured that anyone with their own opinion would never get a university degree. The same policy applied to those who wanted jobs. Their repression went to such an extent that many families and communities encouraged at least one of their family members to become a religious guard so that he could play the role of a mediator and rescue them in times of difficulty. It is always after gaining power that Islamists reveal their true colors and surprise people with intolerance. Contemporary uprisings in Islamic countries and Islamist access to power have always proven the dualistic nature of Islamists. It is heartbreaking that this deception has been at work in many Islamic countries, but no Muslim nations have been able to learn a lesson and discern the crafty nature of Islam. They would rather blame fundamentalist groups for hijacking Islam. After the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, hundreds of unhappy Muslims who protested against the mullahs were killed simply because they believed that the mullahs did not follow true Islam. This is the response we receive from many moderate Muslims who say that Islam is a religion of peace. Islamists are hijacking it. Unfortunately, moderate Muslims do not know and do not want to know Islam for themselves. They have just been compelled to repeat from childhood that Islam is inherently good, peaceful, and nothing bad could exist in it. Islam has deprived Muslim nations of free thinking and speaking. This Islamic problem enabled the mullahs to redirect the educational principles of our country to reflect Mecca's unquestionable nomadic principles. Because of Islam, the mullahs abandoned impartiality, rejected the education of females, and showed hostility to non-Islamic values. They disrespected Iranian history, replacing the thousands of years old logo lion on Iran's national flag with the Arabian logo of Allah. They robbed the younger generation of knowledge about the history and ideals of their country, which their forefathers had passed on from generation to generation. But those young people who did not look Islamic and refused to wear a beard did not have access to jobs and education. Girls who gave weight to the culture of their forefathers were tortured or denied basic rights. Iranians from minority groups were treated as second-class citizens and persecuted because of their beliefs. This is what Islamists have been doing to their people over the last 1,400 years of Islamic history. They stripped them of their national honor and deprived them economically, culturally, and morally. They fought creativity and blocked the doors of prosperity to their nations. They prospered only when they occupied and looted other lands, as the Ottoman Empire did. Their political principles only served their own interests for establishing the Islamic Shari'a. The Islamists' backward law and culture help neither Iranians nor any other Muslim nations in the world. Islamists never want to see the forest for the trees. They see everything through the eyes of an Arabian dry and lifeless culture. Anytime they had an opportunity to rule, they created a community in which the atmosphere of hate led to ongoing political and social violence. Still aim to serve. Although discriminations and hostilities were increasingly shadowing us day after day, we still aimed to do something for the country in any way we could as long as we were allowed to breathe. We could not imagine that the mullahs could be so deceptive and hostile. We learned our bitter lessons gradually. A famous mullah even said openly in his television talk that if a mullah is in power, no one will be able to bring him down unless he is dead and does not have anyone to continue his mission. He will never let himself be voted out of office and never allow the government of Allah to fall into the hands of a less faithful person or an infidel. This is the major reason for the Islamist Republic of Iran to remain in power for more than 3 decades. The mullahs have used a system that tightly controls people in the Sharia frame as a means of enslaving them to their fundamentalist government. People have no choice but to show allegiance to them to survive or prosper. However, we the lovers of democracy were counting on the people's 80% vote, which was cast in favor of the President Bani Sadr in the first presidential election. We thought people would not forget their first zeal easily, but keep it for the next parliamentarian election. We also thought that if the mullahs allowed us to nominate a candidate in the future, and we regained a measure of power, people would be encouraged to stand behind us more courageously. The president's escape discouraged many of us who were his colleagues and had battled hardships with him. How could a people's president escape for the sake of his own life and leave millions of his followers as orphans? Despite all the difficulties, I did not want to allow our loneliness to disappoint us in fighting for freedom. I was still hoping to reach Parliament in the second election and speak up more strongly alongside other opposition leaders who remained in the country and remained in the Parliament from the first parliamentary election. I was thinking that the mullahs would quickly lose their position among Iranians and would not increase their vote. My hope lay in the dissatisfaction of many Iranians dealing with the economic hardship caused by the mullahs. Many people secretly expressed their dissatisfaction to me.